Steve is a serial entrepreneur, started his career as an entrepreneur at 18 years old, got into self-taught, got into exports and imports, and now owns 4 production facilities in India for making masks and gowns. And he's also got partnerships in Thailand, making gloves. Steve is also a good partner of, KishKindha is a good partner of BiHive. You can find their products on BiHive as well. And I am hoping that Steve will share with us a lot of his experiences being a manufacturer and being somebody who's importing products into the US regularly, on what he has learned from his past experiences and what he's expecting in the future. So I'm really excited to have you all. Thank you. And for all of the audience, you can find all of their companies in here. And later, if you want to reach out anybody individually, write to us and we'll connect you. Okay. Today's topic is related to what changes and pitfalls you should know about and prepare for. We want the audience today to walk out after this session prepared for any issues, concerns, or any things that we expect to change in the future. My objective with setting up this particular topic was because we are at a cusp where the industry is changing, the habits are changing, the regulations are changing, and so many other factors are changing. So those of us who are in the PPE business or who are importing or exporting, how do we tackle these issues? What are the things we should be concerned about or prepared for? And how do we make sure that we actually are satisfying the needs of our customers while maintaining our businesses? And that's what we'll try to achieve from this. I forgot to introduce myself for those who don't know. So I am Minesh Pore. I'm the founder, co-founder and CEO of BiHive. BiHive was set up by me and my co-founders, Michael and Brent, but all of us come from the sourcing industry. Brent was the CEO of a NASDAQ-listed company, Global Sources, that used to help companies source for the longest time and worked with some of the largest buyers. I was also at Global Sources after Intertech and managing all of the international sales for them. We sold the company to Blackstone in 2017, and in 2019, we decided that we wanted to start something on our own to really solve 2 issues in the sourcing industry: trust and transparency. And not knowing COVID was going to hit, not knowing we were going to get into the PPE trade, we were generally looking at sourcing as an industry. But there are some amazing learnings that we've had over the last year of COVID, and I hope I can share that with all of you as well as part of the presentation. So let's just dig in. Like I mentioned earlier, there is a shift in the supply chain and the realities are changing. My question to all the panelists, maybe starting with Steve, is what are the things you guys are doing to prevent that your merchandise or your products are not being seized either at the port of export or import?
Thanks for the introduction, by the way, Manesh. I think the first thing is the actual country that it's actually coming from, the manufacturing origin country. That has a big role, like if it's from China versus if it's from Europe or India or Southeast Asia, something like that, because there's inherent risk from those countries. I mean, there's a big problem when you see China, made in China on PPE, because that's predominantly in Southeast Asian countries. There's a lot more risk there because there's a lot more fraud, a lot more scams, certain things like that. With the manufacturer that we predominantly have in India, there hasn't been too many issues because India has good relationships with the US and has a high level of regulation as well from the actual, from FDA and everything that actually complies with. And the level of the amount of testing that's needed as well. So it really depends on the actual country, I think, that it really comes from. But in saying that, there's a lot of things that we're ourselves putting in place especially as we roll into getting like our 510K for surgical gowns, for instance. We're doing a lot more things to implement safety and security in there using certain holograms as well as QR codes. QR codes is the biggest thing to track, along with the normal stuff like lot numbers and things like that. But it's an ever-growing problem, and it's not ever going to go away. It's just how can you minimize that by not raising? It's a teeter-totter, right? The amount of cost that you're putting in there versus the amount of security for your customers, and it depends on the product, I think, too, and the area. So,
okay, Andre, David. Andre or David?
Yes, sorry, I was on mute. Thank you for the intro, Manesh, and also welcome everyone. Today's discussion. I think adding on to what Stephen said, I would also talk a lot about trigger documentation. And what I mean by trigger documentation is, I think Stephen mentioned an important point, which is how do we do the appropriate level of due diligence without necessarily creating a cost impact that's not beneficial, to both sides or both parties. And so we have been looking a lot at admissibility documents, right? How do we involve admissibility documents in a smart way upfront to give, red flag indicators or give an idea of things that you might want to be concerned with. And for those who are not familiar with admissibility documents, they're a little bit more specific than contract terms. They're really talking about specific things that you do and do not want to see, and essentially getting the producer of that product to attest in writing or to certify certain things that are taking place. So, and these can also be tied to your contract terms and your agreements. So I think that those are smart things that kind of start the discussion, but obviously as we go further, we need to also talk a little bit about how we get to understand and know the supply chains that we're dealing with.
Yeah. David, anything to add to that? You'd have to unmute yourself though. Okay, I think I'm not sure David is on it. We'll move to the next one. What does the future of PPE look like as a product category? Which product categories remain in demand? What are the habitual changes happen during COVID that will affect product demands? What I meant by this, and I think you guys can see it in day-to-day living, this is a kind of a change that happens once in a century or once in a lifetime. What we will see pretty much normalizing, and this we've seen after SARS in Hong Kong. So all of you guys who've been to Hong Kong, after SARS, masks became pretty much a normal. You could see people wearing masks in most of the Asian countries, Japan, Korea, Hong Kong, even when they had the smallest of the flu. What we see now happening after this is things like using vinyl gloves in F&B, vinyl gloves everywhere where food and beverage will be served or touched, grocery stores, or if you're looking at any of the hotels where the cleaning ladies come in, they all will be wearing these gloves. In past, some places did have these regulations, but this is going to be a part of everyday life. What that means is the demand for these products is going to be normalized, and these are going to be taken to a strategic importance. All the PPEs that were what happened during 2020 because of the high demand was that some of these products that we did not think about too much, like today, Steve is dealing in nitrile gloves or gowns. We did not regularly pay attention. A layman did not pay attention to this topic. Now everybody knows this nitrile gloves. Everybody comes to me, oh, do you do nitrile gloves? They don't really understand what that means and what the composition of nitrile is, but everybody's talking about it. And this is going to be an habitual change where people will accept wearing it, no matter what your political perspective is. You say, okay, we need to wear this to protect. So how do you guys see that affecting the industry? And what are the things that you, from your experience or your kind of magnifying lens, talk about for the people in this audience to be prepared for? Who wants to go first? Andre?
I'll jump in. And I think, Manesh, one thing that you said is extremely important is that the spotlight has never been brighter on essential items, right? And you're spot on that the word personal protective equipment will certainly be a term that will carry forward for a long time. I think what's important, though, are the questions that are going to begin to be asked around those items, right? The gold rush, certainly in our opinion, is over, right? And the normalization of trade is starting to come into place, right? And I think we'll talk more about what the shifts in payment or financial aspects, but also the shifts in expectations, right? We've moved beyond a crisis, and now we've moved to a place where we need to understand a lot more about what the expectations are around these items. So as we see those shifts in habits and in a shift of kind of what we call the new normal, I think just along with every other normalized product or commoditized product, there are going to be a set of fundamental expectations around the products. And we're certainly seeing things related to quality, right? But we're also seeing a lot of things related to reuse and recycle, especially for disposable items. And as we talk about sustainability and environmental impacts. And then first and foremost, also how they're being made, right? You know, and are they being made in ways or by people that they should not be made by? And so these are all sorts of things I think that come into play as the industry starts to shift from a sort of crisis mode into a more traditional trade mode.
Right. I mean, and Andre, to that point, right? I mean, this is something that is going to leave an impact for a very long time to come, and it's going to be. I mean, you know, we will not even talk about it much, and it will be just a part and parcel of expectations, you know, and people did not know. I personally knew of these products, but that them being categorized and a new L2 being developed or a L1 being developed, level 1 category being developed as PPEs is a new thing, and it is for here to stay. Steve, you are actually working in this sector, and you are actually innovating products, and you're bringing in new products into this sector. What do you see, and what are you strategizing?
Well, I mean, there's two answers to the question. You have, I mean, on the actual consumer side, what are the consumers going to see more? I absolutely think hand sanitizers. I mean, 3-plies here in the U.S., depending on where you're at. Like I'm in Texas, they just lifted the mask mandate.
Yes.
So I guess Texas and Florida are kind of the oddballs out here. But the rest of it, I mean, what people are going to see and the mass produced products versus on the business side of what's more strategic and more profitable for factories on a quality perspective to make is kind of, that's two separate answers. On the business side, I mean, it's tough to compete on small margins, right? With China, there's no doubt about it. I mean, there's slowly but surely moving away from China, and there's going to be a big, there's already a big push, but there's going to be even more of a big push, I think, from the US government side, but that's neither here or there. What we're mainly focusing on and on the sustainability aspect of it is the high barrier to entry products, 510K products. I mean, things that people aren't focusing on. Nitrile gloves, everybody's heard of it by now, right?
Yes.
But no one's really heard of level 3 and level 4 surgical gowns within reason. I think everybody's heard of that within the PP sector, but a lot of people are forgetting the niches that are really going to drive business, and that's what we're looking for, like specific ones like drapes and certain things that are a huge shortage. That a lot of these bigger factories have switched because they already were set up for manufacturing a lot of the bigger PPE, and it's easier for them to switch their machines to something like at the beginning of last year. I was in India for 3.5 months setting up our supply chains there, and there was people that converted their bag machines into 3-ply masks, just because no one's buying bags, right? Everybody's buying 3-ply masks. So I think there's two sides of the spectrum there. On the manufacturer side is looking, there's people that are making stuff now And there's people, I guess, just planning for the future. There's two types of businesses as well. And that's what we're trying to do. That's what we are doing and going to continue to do. So we have long-term growth.
David, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think, you know, it's an interesting market. We've had a good 12 months for the market to stabilize, but I'm still not convinced that we really know where it's going at this stage. You know, I have some friends in Malaysia that have plants and they're not even taking phone calls because their order books are booked out for the next 12 months or so. So I think, you know, we've seen a lot of PPP move from a nice to have product to a sort of must have product, national security, critical item, which means that, okay, where are you going to source from? Are the relationships with those clients, those supply chains, those governments appropriate for a critical item? So you may find that, you know, people start onshoring, they may start moving their supplies to different places. I don't think people have had time to think about that at this stage because it's just been, you know, just getting a product to start with. The second thing is I think that you've got to really keep your ears close to the ground in terms of regulations and what's changing. I mean, start with the premise that 80% of products that were tested for PPE actually failed. Start with that premise, right? So there's a lot that can go wrong because only 15 to 20% were actually passing on first test. So if you start with that premise, there's a lot of change that need to be made in the industry to actually get it right. And I think, you know, Steve was talking earlier on about, you know, traceability and batch code and these sorts of things are going to be critically important moving forward.
Yeah. And, you know, in terms of products as well, the categories that were there, again, to that point, Stevie rightly pointed out, hand wipes, sanitizers, and now I'm seeing a surge for a demand of syringes because everybody needs to get vaccinated and there is just not that much production capacity. And I'm again seeing a lot of people jumping into the syringe market and saying, I have the source, I can get you the source, etc. And it's really, really looking like a rerun of what we saw with N95s and then KN95s and then gloves and now syringes. And it just keeps going. A product changes and people are just going crazy.
Yeah, they're moving where the money is. I mean, ultimately syringes, I mean, that just like gloves, they're 510K items. So there's only a finite amount of manufacturers out there all around the world that are making them.
Yeah.
I mean, like 3-ply, I mean, not to change products, but when it first started 3-ply, there was no money in 3-ply.
Yeah.
I mean, there was literally machines, they had to blow all the dust off of them because they were producing other products. Especially, I mean, I went to Istanbul back in late on December into January. And then I went to India and went from Chennai to Mumbai to Delhi, all up and down the thing. And just seeing all the different factories and how they did work and how they were transitioning from when it was really picking up into January, February, and March last year. It was very interesting. But going back to your point on the syringes, I guess we can talk about people's greed too, right? But I mean, I mean, it's people go where the money is. I mean, that's I guess an inherent trait for people. So
yeah,
and syringes is very unique. Yeah,
people have lost their livings, right? We talked about it earlier.
Yeah.
When we were discussing, and Andre talked about how he knows people who've been in the entertainment industry who are now doing the PPE and using the networks for that. I don't blame those people. I just think they need to be better prepared for what is in the industry. They need to understand more or hire people that understand more, use resources that are helping them do more due diligence, helping them become compliant and all of that. And actually those guys can use their networks to their benefit. Many of the people that jump into the trade are only using the network and they're not thinking about these aspects. And that's why we started this set of webinars to educate people. I don't think most of the people are out to scam. Yes, there are some, but most of the people are not out to scam. They just make mistakes because they don't understand the pitfalls of the industry. And how can we help them improve is why we started this set of webinars as well. Actually, it's a good segue into the next one because...
Manish, before you go, can I just make one comment, just because I think it's important. While it's good, I believe, to have an entrepreneurial spirit. And it's great that actually we are finding areas for the private sector to be able to fill some of the much needed capacity that's out there. I think that's also critical in terms of infrastructure. I believe one of the important things that has sort of been uncovered here is that we probably as a nation and as governments and as private sector have taken PPE for granted, right? And sort of the pandemic and has really put it in perspective. I believe we had a lot of warnings, but never to this magnitude, right? And I think what's incredibly important for the people on this call, as well as people looking to get into this business or this area as an opportunity, it's fantastic because there's a role to help in protecting the public interest. But remember, these are instruments of trust, right? And the worst thing you can do with an instrument of trust is betray the public's trust, right? By not doing the right types of due diligence, by not ensuring that the instruments can actually serve their intended purpose. And I always try to use the common sense lens, right? It's important, or it becomes important, when that betrayal is connected to someone you know and you love and you care about, right? And so you don't want family members or loved ones or other people that are important to you to have products that are not serving the intended purpose. And so just keep that in mind as we're pursuing sort of these entrepreneurial opportunities as well.
Yeah, and that's when we can show, I'm going to show this video that you sent us, and that will give people some perspective of what could be in a factory. And this is a 3-ply factory. I assume it's in Bangladesh, Andre, and it's a factory that somebody set up with the same objective to make these 3-ply masks. But as you see the video, and then we'll discuss more about it.
Manish, I don't even know where to begin, you know, in this discussion. Just everything is wrong.
So many things that are wrong with this, right? I mean, those of us, I almost fell off my chair when you sent me that video. I was like, I mean, there is just so many. There is a health issue. There is a process issue. There is child labor there. There is all kinds of red flags in there. And these are the type of people that got into the business. So until you really know the value of compliance or value of actually QC and QA and all of that, you will never even try to find out the manufacturing process, and you'll get screwed in this business.
Yeah, I want to share with you. So this particular video is actually related to a subcontractor. So it's not a primary facility. But again, you know, when you have a gold rush, you have agents, or you have sales representatives, or you have people that have the ability to import that are essentially selling capacity, right? They're brokers of capacity. And one thing you have to understand is that a person selling capacity does not mind to sell it multiple times to the same person, right? And a lot of people don't realize that you have people not just selling capacity, but you have the desire to want to produce as much as you can and make as much money as you can. So on one hand, you have more coming into the system than, you know, one potential producer can probably do, and then you have a factory thinking, well, you know, I'm in the middle of a crisis. I need to make as much money as I can. I don't know what my future is. So let's kind of source this out to also, or bid it out to smaller satellite, you know, operations that can help to extend our capacity, right? And we, you know, at HAP, we actually shared this video and other videos with the General Accounting Office here in the US in some of our discussions to say, look at, you know, contract agreements with first tier suppliers that really don't spell out clearly the do's and don'ts and don't result in sort of boots on the ground or some level of verification about what's happening, it's a dangerous situation, especially when you're talking about brokers and agents that are not known, not established, and you're talking about buyers that don't have the resources or the ability to actually understand what's happening. You know, this video, believe it or not, is probably in the situation of, let's say, independent sellers, people that are just, you know, purchasing stock somewhere, wherever they can get it and are lucky enough to get it. This is probably happening more often than you realize. And a lot of people are probably living on borrowed time, because the enforcement environment, as the crisis is decreasing, is changing, right? And the attention is really being focused around how these things are happening. I think Stephen brought up a great point where they are happening, you know, the actual geographic and country of origin. I think that's incredibly important. And I think when people buy masks, they have no idea there's probably even laws that speak to the components, right? And the origin of the components and the materials and all those things for imports. So it really is a serious undertaking beyond everything that comes with the regulatory aspect of it, right? And the claims and the quality. So you really need to ensure that you have a real understanding of the people that you're partnering with. And even then, you still have to exercise reasonable care. You still have to exercise some degree of due diligence, and you still need to be able to, in a situation where you're called to question, provide evidence or proof to support those investigations and how you went about doing it.
Yeah. And to that point, David, would you, I mean, this is the right time to talk about Verify and what Verify has done in terms of how do you make sure that, let's say I'm a buyer and a buyer comes to BSI, what kind of tools does Verify or other tools that you have give buyers to do more of this kind of provide that transparency into the manufacturers and the manufacturing process?
Well, thanks, Manesh. Well, I think it applies to both buyers and suppliers can use these instruments of trust. And, you know, we always say beyond quality is trust. And the definition of quality is product quality. It's about process quality, and it's about behavior quality. And if you just look at that video you had there, number one, what is a product spec? You know, is that product meeting the specifications, meeting the regulations for the intended market that it's going to be placed on? Because if it's subject to a test, is it going to pass? The next one is process spec, right? So the process, most personal protective equipment, you know, medical devices have to be produced in premises that have ISO 13485. This is GMP, good manufacturing practice. Now, you didn't see good manufacturing practice there because those COVID-19 masks probably came with COVID, if you know what I mean. But there was no guarantee. I mean, it didn't look as though that establishment was a facility that was practicing what I call good manufacturing practice, okay? And the third one is behavior quality. So behavior quality is about, you know, social risk, it's about, you know, human rights, it's about environment and so forth. So I think they're the three things, instruments of trust. And then the third one is actually getting that validated and verified. I mean, that's your quality mark, right? That an independent organization has been out there to support you. And there's a lot of, you know, very competent certification bodies out there, like, you know, BSI, and there are others there as well, which have to meet the requirements of certification and national standards bodies. And they got some very smart people in there that know all the rules and the regulations for the markets you're going to export to. And I would say, you know, find those business partners and let them help you, right? Put the right product specs, process specs, and behavioral specs and the verification in there to give you those instruments of trust. And then you can move that to what you call something like a Bsi Verify Profile, which is almost like a supplier passport. In the same way, before you go on a holiday and you go to a hotel and a resort, you want to check out the photos, you want to check out where it is, you want to check out the location. So a Bsi Verify Profile is an instrument of trust, where we go in and we look at that facility and we look at 32 pieces of information, which look at their legal status, company ownership, photos, existing certifications they may have, countries that they're exporting to. So, someone can go in there with confidence and see real factories, real people making those products and their credentials, and then, buy with trust. So some suppliers get this and they use that to promote their organization, and some buyers specify that if you want to supply with me, you've got to have that as a minimum requirement of supply, because my suppliers have got to meet modern day supply chain requirements, and that means
David,
product.
Actually last year we did a lot of business with NHS, so the government of UK, and we were directly selling to them. And as you know, our business is sitting in between. We are a platform in between buyers and the factory. But NHS, actually, we worked with NHS to set up some of the standards and BSI requirement or BSI standards, as well as the pre-shipment inspection standards. We were able to set those that met NHS standards and have all the factories that we bought from get those qualified. So we had to work through that process. And because I come from the compliance background, it's a little easy to understand all of it, but I really find it a daunting task. Even with the understanding that I had, it was a daunting task. So I can imagine how difficult it can be for somebody who's not in that business. So, and that is again a pitfall, right? And now what David was talking to, the Verify tool that BSI has developed, if you don't understand your suppliers, ask BSI to do it for you. BSI is an expert in doing that. Why do you need to use your mind? Ask somebody like a BSI, okay, can you do this for me? Steve, to this, right? I mean, from your side, you're sitting on the supplier side, and I'm sure your buyers that have asked certain specific requirements and stuff. Would you want to share some real life experience or stories of what has been asked for you, and how have you met those requirements? Or what did you do when you set up I know that you ramped up the manufacturing in the last year or so, right? You doubled or tripled the manufacturing capacities. What are the things that you did from a compliance perspective, certification perspective yourself to improve trust?
Not drown, at least try to. Trying to get certifications done. Man, the toughest thing to ever do is 510K and GMP and everything, especially if it's the first time doing it. And good thing we had some great people behind us in doing so. But it's in the pandemic, most factories, you have time to build up to that. And good thing we had a few of those in place. But I want to say it felt like it was never ending, and it still is, because there's just constant more and more certifications, and then testings never end. It's just developing good practices around those and SOPs around those. So then it kind of falls in your actual manufacturing. So it's just another step in the SOP of your manufacturing of it. But especially with COVID, there's been so many changes. The FDA just came out with the 82-page book of new changes for just the labeling of certain PPE products, for instance. So it's constantly staying up with those, and it's a never-ending task. It's never ending. So you have to have good people on your compliance side.
Yep. So let's.
I think, Steve, I had a CEO that said to me once, he said, I love my certification because it provides me the mechanism to do the right thing and an instrument for continuous improvement, and I can sleep at night. And I thought they were just beautiful words, because, there is a lot of stuff there, but you're not alone. And I think, your business is a lot better by having predictable, standards which provide those instruments for, continuous improvement and a mechanism to do the right thing.
Yeah, and
absolutely.
And to that same question, the next question that we have is related to the quality requirements of PPEs, right? To the same question that we were discussing earlier. So far, as the things start normalizing and the product becomes less critical but still strategic, I am sure there is going to be quality requirements both from the buyers and as well as from the federal side that will change. And both US, Europe, UK, everybody is having different requirements change. And we have seen over the last year, actually last year, while we were in the midst of this all, and we were shipping, I remember we were shipping 2 planes full of masks to University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. And the rules changed on us regards the white list and the non-white list in China. At the same time, the FDA changed the requirements on those KN95s as well in the midst of it all, while we have 2 planes ready to fly out of Shanghai. And we had to go and look, and it was just documentation that we had to go through and make changes on. But there are a lot of things like that that are happening on a day-to-day basis. So Steve, you're right, you have to keep on top of that and stop from drowning. But what do you expect in terms of quality requirements to change? Are they going to get stricter? Do you think they are going to relax? Or how are you seeing, all of you from your perspectives, how are you guys seeing it?
Oh, I think absolutely it's going to get more and more strict. I mean, more and more supply comes online, more and more people get certified in certain testings and certifications that takes some time, like EPA, for instance, and 510K. It takes, I mean, 6 months to a year. I got a good friend that took them 9.5 months to finally get their EPA.
Yeah.
And so just more and more people that come online. Of course, the quality competition is going to set in, quality is going to set in, and then, I mean, brand and marketing, it's going to get to normal competitive business. And eventually on the I guess the industry life cycle, eventually you're going to get to the back end of it where only a few survive, and it's going to get very, very, very competitive. But obviously it's still on the uptrend. It's just getting to the point where, for instance, like our ultrasonic welding machines that we have to buy, we only buy from these one factory, these very, very few factories that we got a great relationship with one of the big distributors like Cardinal Health, Medline. And we got that relationship and we knew exactly which ones to buy, because the other ones that we were buying, they skipped an actual weld at the very end. Simplest little things, but when you're doing like a sterile and a surgical gown testing or something like that, and you're testing on a stitch where it's viral penetration or permutation or a blood pathogen or any of the water penetration test, that goes right through there. So it gets a lot more complicated depending on the product, but it definitely is getting to where the quality supersedes quantity, because quantity is out there.
And Andre and David, you both come from the TIC world, and you know, and you've seen this across different products. Can you share some experiences that you've seen that will relate to this, or what you see happening in terms of quality requirements?
Well, Manesh, I mean, we have a whole department that looks after medical devices, you know, and there are various grades there, starting with personal protection equipment through to implants. And, you know, what I know in this industry is I know that I don't know. So I've got to go and find someone that does know, because it is very, very specific. And just like, you know, Jeff was saying then, you know, even with gowns, there's some very specific requirements. And, you know, the rules and the regulations are changing all the time. And I just can't emphasize enough that this is an area of extreme specialization. It's an area of regulatory requirements, and the last thing you want is products going onto the market which don't meet the requirements, because then you got the product recall issues and everything associated with distressed cargo. And as I said, start from the premise that, you know, 80% of products that go to market actually fail in the first time. So you've got to start with that sort of premises as the baseline. And many people that do go through the thorough process of getting their certifications, they're extremely proud of it when they get it, because they are setting themselves apart from the rest of the industry. They will be the ones that survive, and they will be the ones that people buy from in the long term, because they can trust it. So I can give you normally, hundreds of examples of things that go wrong, but I don't think that's the point. The point is that through the COVID-19, when you look at the results that came from our labs for things that were going into the UK to meet the UK and the EU specifications and requirements, only 15 to 20% of products passed the first time, meaning 80% failed, right? So those organizations had to go back and then demonstrate and put in the appropriate instrumentations of trust and processes to get it right.
Yeah. Andre, you were talking to a lot of government, federal people, and federal organizations as well, right? And you're consulting many of them. I'm sure you're seeing this already.
Yeah, I think one of the things, as you all know, I mean, it's even the title of today's presentation, scams have brought a lot of attention and I would say regulatory attention, because obviously these are things that are defrauding the public interest, right? And I think what you can expect is where you have a highly polarized industry where it's being driven by a large percentage of opportunists, rather than sort of the legitimate trade industry, is that there is a need for greater regulation and greater oversight to ensure that the public interest is protected. So I agree with both Stephen and David said. You can expect tighter regulation. I think you can expect greater enforcement. That enforcement will be driven by both country of origin as well as I think materials as well, right? As we think about quality, I mean, there's the performance aspect of it, but there's also a lot of discussion around what these masks are doing to the environment, right? The materials that the masks are being made with, right? What are the synthetic materials doing, right? Versus natural materials, right? What are you breathing in? So I think there's a whole discussion, right, and discovery process that's still ongoing. But what I think anyone in this industry can expect right now is expect that you need to do more, right, than what you were doing before, and expect that enforcement at ports of entry for merchandise is going to become greater.
Yeah, no, completely right. And to summarize this point, this is very, very important, right? I mean, as the regulatory requirements change, and they might be different in different countries that you are importing into, and you need to be very well prepared. And what David said was right, get the experts to do it for you. Don't try to do it yourself. Otherwise you will have pitfalls. And I mean, I know a lot of people in this group that are there listening to us, and I know some of them have invested a lot of their earnings into this business. I myself have put my career on the line to get into this business. By chance got into it, but we have to be very careful. We have to do a lot more due diligence. I've been in situations last year itself where my entire company could have gone under for one or two cases. And there are all these situations that can happen because of quality. If one single recall of a large order can take you off completely, especially for all these guys that are small, medium businesses. So we have to be very, very careful, very diligent when we are we're doing these trades.
Manesh, I want to just share one quick story. We have been involved on the back end and working with several different customers that have been involved in detention orders, right, coming into the U.S., right, for various reasons. But one of the most interesting thing that I want to share that I've learned from this process is how simple the economics were after we looked at an investment in doing some form of due diligence beyond a simple contract, right? Versus what the investment was in going through the process of having to sort of defend the actions around the product, And so for me, the economics, right, are something that you really need to ask yourself, right? If you're talking about a 1% or 2% or less investment against something that actually can not only bring your business under, as you mentioned, Manesh, but also have you elevated to the status of a high risk importer, right? why would you do that when the penalty is so great, right? Yeah. So I would really encourage people to really not look at the complexity, but purely look at it as the same way they would look at automobile insurance, right? Or life insurance, anything. You know, as David mentioned, there's a ton of entities out there. HAP offers also a different form of a solution to get people into factories for you. You know, really find credible solutions that can fit your economic model, because there are credible solutions that can fit your economic model. Don't ignore the importance of the due diligence, because when the worst situation is coming, you will understand that the economic model for not doing it made no sense at all.
Yeah, understand. Thank you, Andre. I appreciate that. And it's really, this is something that we have had sleepless nights over and thought about many times. So I know what you're talking about very well. We know that this industry has been flooded with counterfeit products. What are the tools that are available to buyers to make sure they don't get counterfeit products? And this is something that we've seen not just in this industry and many other industries. So what are the tools, according to you guys, that are available to buyers as well as sellers? Andre, you want to, or Steve?
I'll say Andre and David, I think this is right up your alley. I've just seen the bad stuff, not you guys take it.
I think it's like, you know, in life, if you want to go and cook a good meal, you have to follow the recipe and the ingredients. And I think, you know, the ingredients here are well established. And as I said before, you know, go and find an expert and a business partner that you're happy to work with. And then once you do that, you know, get your appropriate certifications in place. And you know, I always say hope is not a method, right? Hope is not a method. Look at these as the cost of production and the cost of compliance, because it's a bit like fire insurance. It has no value until you actually have a fire. And if you don't have these instruments of trust, well, then you don't have the mechanisms of trust. It's harder to get a reasonable sort of premium. It's hard to access markets. So, you know, the top 4 reasons why people go for certification is, number 1, to improve their systems and processes and repeatability. Number 2, trust. Number 3, access markets. And number 4, to reduce quality mistakes, which are all really good economic reasons to get involved. So look at product standards, look at process standards, 13485 and any other appropriate ISO standards that you need. And I always say go for ISO, because ISO is ratified by 165 countries around the world, and particularly MDSAP, Medical Device Single Audit Program. One audit will mean that you can have market access into US, into Canada, into Japan, into UK, into Australia. So it's you know, one certification recognized in many places. And then the third one is you know, get the appropriate standards for behavior and maybe a Bsi Verify Profile. There's a great instrument of trust in your passport to access markets and give buyers confidence. And as we say, finally, once you have that in place, you then have the instruments of beyond quality is trust. And that's where the world is going now. People expect quality. It's a basic requirement, but beyond quality is trust, and therefore implement the instruments of trust to achieve that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I only have maybe a few more things to add, but when David and I used to work together, we always talked about a license to operate, you know, and a lot of what he's describing is really the license to operate if you want to be involved in this industry. But listen, at the same token, I understand that there are all ranges and scales of businesses, right? You have large organizations that are involved in this industry. but you also have small and medium-sized organizations that are involved in the industry. And so I want to speak to some of the small and medium-sized organizations as well, right? Because I think they make up a large volume. And I would really encourage you to really look toward also common sense standards, right? We always talk about certification and sort of those are the outputs, right? But I'm a big advocate that if you can't obtain certification, there's no reason that you can't obtain good inputs, right? And if you can't focus on the output, do everything you can to focus on the input, because the inputs can create is what actually make up the certification. So I encourage people to ask questions, right? I encourage people, again, to focus on admissibility documents. I encourage people to also establish their own reasonable care standard, right? And so when I talk about reasonable care standard, I really mean that if you need to answer tough questions, what information and what evidence do you have to back up, what you're saying? And I think if you start from there, you'll be able to do the proper vetting for yourself that you need in order to determine, whether or not, this is a relationship that you need to go forward. And then obviously, depending on the materiality of what you're involved with and those things, it's always a good practice, if you can't do it yourself, to hire an organization like an HAP or a BSI or someone of this sort that has market recognition and credibility to actually go and do the work on the ground for you.
Yep, true. So we are close to an hour right now. I will open up, we'll continue on the discussion, but I'll open up to anybody who wants to ask questions to us. Please type in your questions and we will take them up here. So the next part, again, is related to, and it's to the last question, which is government regulations. And the government regulations, the way I see it, they're going to be, of course, related to the quality aspect, but there's also going to be what is related to the transparency of the supply chain or the traceability of the supply chain. And again, I know this is something that we feel that it is, as traders or as people in the business, we don't pay large attention to this, but this is going to be upfront and center in the coming years, especially with the PPEs. And Andre, you made a point about the materials that I use, right? So whether it is gloves or gowns or masks, all the materials that are going into making these are non-biodegradable. And the impact of these are going to be long-term on the environment. How and what government regulations will be there in place, or if you're already seeing any of these coming into manufacturing, or if Steve, you're seeing this affecting you already, I'd like to hear your perspectives.
Well, Manesh, one thing I want to kind of add on top of what you just said is that if anyone on the call is not familiar with Section 307 of the Us Tariff Act of 1930, you need to become familiar with that, because that speaks specifically to products produced under child or forced labor. And when it talks about the products, it talks about mined, produced, or manufactured, any part and any component. And so a lot of times what I see are people focusing on the obvious, right? But if you are sourcing products from certain regions of the world, and if you're sourcing products through certain raw material supply chains, you need to be very clear and very aware about this, because these are the types of things that are going to be subject to heightened scrutiny. Already, we are communicating with many state governments. We're also communicating with federal government, and the communication is all about where the probability are for these items to be introduced into ports of entry, right, and where they're coming from. And I think that supply chain due diligence is a term that importers need to become quite familiar with, right? And we're seeing supply chain due diligence law revealing itself essentially everywhere. We see it now in the US, we see it in Europe, we see it in different parts of Eastern Europe as well. And I think it's important that we understand that a lot of the things that we're accustomed to in terms of quality, that's only one aspect. But when we start to look at these other import laws that really have to do with the product not making its way to where it's intended to go, you know, is something that really needs to be a heightened focus for the future.
Right. Steve, you're saying something.
Yeah, I think a big part of it too, and something to mention is a lot of people, we've been under EUA, I mean, the Emergency Use Act for since February or March last year. Not a lot of people know that once that goes away, you got to be FDA certified to import everything, and that's going to be a big pivotal point. Sorry, a couple hours of sleep last night. It's going to be a big turning point, and I think it's going to happen possibly later on this year, way later this year. But I think that's going to be a big turning point on that, as well as the crackdown of, for instance, a big hot button right now is gloves. It's not right now. It's going to be, and it has been. That's the biggest scam and fraud out there of really reboxing gloves. Just had that happen to, we actually caught with our manufacturer with Health Select out of Thailand. We helped our LC company that was about to make a several $million transaction with a glove not a manufacturer, but it was a reboxing company that we caught and kind of walked through everything, is like did the sniff test and everything like that. And what I'm trying to say is the regulations will eventually catch up, because the amount of scams and fraud on certain products will eventually catch up to the supply versus demand, to where it's not essential to kind of look the other way, knowing that a lot of these things are happening. But it'll eventually catch up, and it'll happen, I think, this year more and more and more.
Yep. True. So, David, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I just say, you know, go and get a trust mark on your product, and you know, BSI Kite Mark is a great trust mark that's been around for 118 years, and a lot of people in the medical device industry will use that, and it's a performance mark. So, you know, find an expert, and they'll keep you out of trouble, and they'll tell you what are the regulatory requirements, and make sure you have the right documents in the right place at the right time to implement compliance and access those markets, and differentiate your product as being something a little bit sort of different, and you know, getting a high premium for it.
Yeah, I touched upon this next question earlier on, which was raw material traceability, and what are we seeing in this space, or is there anything that buyers sellers can do to mitigate these risks related to the raw materials? Yeah, Andre, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so as we talked about, you know, right now at the import level, we're seeing, you know, greater enforcement. And part of that greater enforcement is also a greater description of expectations, right? And greater clarity around a lot of things, I think, that were a bit gray in terms of what importers were responsible for doing. And so when we look at things around specific subjects, right, related to some import laws, specifically like forced labor laws or child labor laws, what we're seeing is it's very, very clear that the supplier is responsible for ensuring that these things don't exist throughout the supply chain, all the way back to the raw materials, right? And this is prescriptive guidance that was not as clear in the past. There was an understanding that merchandise could not be imported, you know, with these things in the manufacturing process, But whether that meant the tier 1 manufacturing process or it meant the raw material manufacturing process, no one was completely clear. Now it's unequivocally clear that it means and has been defined as the raw material process. So again, I think it's incredibly important to keep an eye on the import regulations as they are emerging or are developing. Also, there are a number of region-wide withhold release orders that have been placed on different areas of the world, right? There are things like denied party lists or detention lists of people that you shouldn't be doing business with. I mean, there's a vast number of things that as an importer, you need to be aware of before you simply bring the product, into the US.
Yeah. Yeah. And Steve, are you seeing any of this, or are you implementing any of these in your raw materials sourcing?
I think it goes back to the region. I mean, we haven't had too many issues with credibility factors of our raw material sourcing because it's from India and it has a low risk of having fraudulent issues and scams and stuff. And saying that, we are implementing it. It depends on the product. I mean, can an RFID chip go in it or something like that? There's only a few things that can do. But our QR code that we're doing on our 510K stuff, that's something new that we're starting and implementing as we actually get our full 510K, because a lot of the EUAs are going away on majority of products besides like rapid test kits and things like that. But it really just depends. But right now we haven't had too many issues with KishKindha product in India. But I mean, for instance, if you're talking about Thailand and gloves where it has an inherently high risk right now, there's a lot more things that I would warn a buyer. If I was buying it, I would look at certain things. You got a certificate of origin. I mean, because the manufacturers, especially on the higher demanded products, that sorry, dog's getting some water next to me. You done, dude? Sorry about that. But there's an inherently high risk, but they can't, I mean, develop new processes because they're busy manufacturing products. So it's all about paper traceability. And I mean, there shouldn't be that many people in the supply chain on that. So you should be able to trace it back and have certain paperwork. I mean, you should have a certificate of origin. I mean, that's a big piece of paperwork that a lot of people in the PP world, on the broker chain or the wholesale chain, whatever you want to call it, they've never even heard of that, for instance. And it's a very simple piece of paper versus I need an SGS or a third-party inspection. I guess SGS is saying like a Kleenex, but you still need a tissue, right? Third-party accredited inspection and bill of lading, right, or airway bill. But a lot of people forget the certificate of origin. So there's a lot of things already in place. It's just a lot of people don't understand, or they just don't know because they're relatively new at it. I think it's important to understand that.
And that's exactly the objective of this webinars, right? We want to make them alert that these things are there and they should be checking these things. Because every time, I don't want to I almost feel like when I get these questions and they say, oh, just give us the bill of lading in the SGS. And I was like, yeah, but that's not going to solve your issue. That's just the tip of the iceberg. You're not really doing your due diligence properly. But I mean, you tell them, no, I've done millions of trades. But I would say, yes, but you're still at a risk. You're exposing yourself. And right now, maybe you fly under the radar, but that's going to change very quickly.
No, absolutely. So. Yeah, I mean, it's not the end all be all. What about a month ago? It was probably the worst story that I had an end customer. It's a really big customer of ours that we kind of took on because we walked them through everything and explained how the process works and made it make sense to them. But they got it wasn't Intertech. I forgot what it was. It might have been, actually it was SGS from Malaysia. They got a bill of lading and everything, and products showed up. It was like 8 containers of nitrile, and only one had gloves in it. The rest had auto parts. So it's not the end all be all. There's a lot of things that you still got to double. I mean, yeah, it's still a lot of risk out there. But within knowing how, I mean, logistics and international logistics is by far the biggest thing. You got to understand how the process works. A lot of people say, for instance, I guess I'm getting off topic here, but it's inherently important as well. Because I mean, a lot of people say CIF, right? I think everybody's heard somebody say CIF, and that's not exactly what they meant. And certain things like that, and it's understanding, I mean, how payment terms work, and especially Incoterms, of where the title hands off. It doesn't really matter where the payment takes place on who pays what, but where's the title handoff, and make sure that it's checked right then, and make sure it's sealed, and you have verifiable sources to make sure that that is without a doubt, well, as much as possible, remove as much risk as possible on that, on a sealed container, and make sure it's not sealed. Make sure you can get the actual, the lock ID number, things like that, where you can actually check yourselves and have the verifications that you need to minimize risk as you're building the suppliers and the relationships with new suppliers.
Yeah. No, but Steve, this is a very good point you pointed out, because I've had multiple customers who've said, I want that product. So let's say the product is from China, and they say, but give me an FOB LA price. And I was like, no, it doesn't. FOB LA doesn't work, my friend. It's like, I don't know, I can't teach you Incoterms. And then there have been people who've been asking various kinds of LCs, and they don't really understand what a different LC means and how to open one, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like, oh, I don't know. I'm not going to educate you on how a LC process works, or how a CIF is different from a DDP to a FOB. And it's like, if you don't know these basics, you really need to study up, my friends.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Incoterms explained. I've sent that link to, I don't know how many people. Just be like, just make sure you know, because you don't want to just, I mean, educate them just to educate them. But if you're trying to do a transaction, or just genuinely want them to educate themselves, yeah, I mean, it's big, because especially if you're getting into a transaction with somebody, they say, I want it CIF delivered. I mean, obviously it's either LDP, landed duties paid, or DDP, delivering all the way to the customer. But if they think CIF is just a generic term, it's a big deal, and it's going to ruin. I've been in a transaction like that, where, I mean, it wasn't double checked, and they said they knew what they wanted, and it is a big thing. Yeah. So.
And to that, the similar issue is with pre-shipment inspections. And because I have David and Andre, I have to ask you guys. I mean, you yourself know how pre-shipment inspections happen, and why something like this, 8 containers with 1 container of gloves and 7 containers of automobile components goes. But this is not new, right? We've seen this happen time and again with many different products, and it still continues to happen. Andre, you are an expert on this. You've been into the factories, you've done all these, and David has done too. So do you want to throw some light on how exactly a pre-shipment inspection works, and where are the problems that can happen in that?
Well, I'll let David talk a little bit about this, because I know he has a lot of expertise in this area. But the one thing that I will say to answer to your question is that when there are transactions that are of high value, there can be, no matter who the organization is, there can be lots of reasons for people to look the other way, right? And so therefore, as you know, Manesh, a big part of HAP's business is actually deals with ethics and integrity of field auditors and field inspectors for that reason, right? It's unfortunately a sort of ugly reality of the business of trade, and trying to ensure that people are kept accountable. But I think, with that being mind, with that in mind, for the most part, I think the principles of the standards and what you're trying to get out of it are the right things. But the focus sometimes simply on certification and not what is actually going into it is not, in my opinion, always right. I think it's important to have resources that you can really trust, right? Trusted sources, and that you really believe that those trusted sources, are providing you with information that's credible and that you can act on. I mean, that sometimes is more important than the document that you have on the other end.
Yep. David?
Yeah, I'm intrigued with Steve receiving auto parts in exchange of something else. But it does remind me of the days when I used to work with one of the TIC companies in their economic affairs division, and we used to had hundreds of thousands of auditors around the world doing pre-shipment inspections of products going into containers and issuing a product classification. And I've seen videos of waste paper taken out of a container with the seal still on the doors, right? So the hinges taken off, the doors taken off with the seal intact, the waste paper taken out, and 2 Mercedes-Benz put in there, and that was done in 5 minutes. So, when there's fraud and people want to commit fraud, it's very, very hard to control it sometimes, but you can have a deterrent against it, right? Now, most pre-shipment inspection in factories, there's lots of games that people can actually play by getting the containers in the front and getting those inspected and not the ones on the back, but there's many ways of mitigating that. So you do pre-production checks, you're doing during production checks, and you do final production checks, and you also make sure that you can do the sealing of the containers as well, pre-stacking. There's also some very interesting technology out now which has been enabled and accelerated as a result of COVID-19. And one of those was with BSI, for example. We had an innovation team looking at remote audits. And because we couldn't get people on site, we had to come up with new technology doing remote audits. And we did over 250,000 of those last year. And in many instances, the customers and the buyers engage in those audits, and they love it because they can actually see everything happening on site, basically on screen, and interacting with that factory. And that does build trust and build sort of relationships. So that's one way to go.
Yeah.
Just going back to something on one of the world's greatest secrets out there, a great standard out there, which a lot of people are not aware of, is called PAS 7000, right? PAS 7000. And maybe you can send that to some of your listeners, Manesh. And that was put together by a lot of retailers, SIPS, which is SIPS, and SCC, which is the Supply Chain Council, and SIPS is the Chartered Institute of Purchasing, and many retailers. And they asked the question, if we were to get rid of all the plugs and sockets, what would be an affordable excellence standard to include all the requirements required for modern day supply chain? So product quality, process quality, behavior quality. And that's what PAS 7000 came out with. And it's a shallow dive into everything from occupational health and safety. It looks at traceability. It looks at intellectual property control, environment, energy, security, CTPAT, transshipment, labor laws and human rights and so forth. And it is a really, really great standard because it's a bit like a sort of a checklist of things that I need to be aware of, because you may get the product quality right and you may get the process quality right, but maybe you get something wrong with transshipment, or something happens with your documentation, or something happens with human rights issues, or CTPAT, security sealing of containers. So this is a really good, I call it affordable excellence standard, which addresses everything that's required for modern day supply chains.
Thank you, David. Guys, we have one question from the audience, which is related to, do you see any future for local manufacturing? I assume it is US local manufacturing, especially for the low-cost 3-ply mass. The current price gap between China imports and the locally produced product is 3 times. Would government take any cognizance of it? As one of the panelists said, importing virus with the mass. Actually, to whoever asked the question, I will try to answer it first. Because I am seeing factories in the US producing 3-ply mass at almost equivalent pricing, or maybe 1.5 times the pricing of the mask that you find in China. So after importing and stuff, it's not that bad. The costs are not that expensive. I'll tell you that China, the costs of 3-ply masks are between 3 to 5 cents right now for type 2, while the ones in made in US could be between 6 to 8 cents. So I don't think there's a big difference. Steve, are you seeing anything in this, or are you guys any comments on regulations making made in USA be the future for these?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Hey, go ahead, David. No, go ahead, David.
I was just going to say, price is one thing, resilience is another thing, and I think this is a big question. And my expertise is actually food and food supply chains. And the COVID-19 was a great awakener for many people, because it asked a fundamental question: was that, are we self-sufficient in food? If you look at the UK, just as an example, in the 60s, it was almost 85, 90% self-sufficient in food. Today, it's 50%. So COVID comes along, borders are blocked, supply chains freeze up, things don't move. Can you feed your nation? So it's not always about cost, but it's about resilience. And if you were to put a fence around every country in the world, right, there's not many countries that would survive more than 3 months, because we've become so interconnected. Right? And that's what I mean by resilience. So the questions that people are going to be asking in the future is that, if medical devices or personal protection equipment, in the event of another pandemic came, do we have the resources, right, to be self-sufficient in there? And is there a price to pay to be resilient? Right? That's a question that none of us know. But I think that is a big question that's being asked post-COVID: price versus resilience and self-sufficiency and being independent on critical issues. Now, you're seeing that already happening with rare earths, critical metals, particular food items, and, does PPE come under that category? I don't know. But if it does, you will see changes in supply chain and incentives to incentivize local producers.
Yeah. Steve, you're saying something.
Yeah, and to add on what David's saying, I mean, specifically on like 3-ply and the local or U.S. manufacturing, I guess it depends on the product, but with 3-ply, there's not too much of an actual employee handling of that to add to the actual cost of it. So yeah, like you said, Manesh, it's the cost isn't too much, but eventually, especially on the, I guess the lesser demanded products or the more manufactured products like 3-ply, I think absolutely it's going to, price is always going to win eventually, because quality is going to eventually beat the actual made in the US or made in Canada, whatever the case is, when your price can be cut to half of what it actually is. So I think it depends on the product. But I mean, you just can't beat, I mean, if it's solely up to labor, you can't beat, I mean, the average person in India, for instance, makes, I mean, a $15 an hour wage equivalent is they make $150 a month, and that's an okay wage. An average person makes $450 USD. The inherent price of living there is way cheaper, but it's all relative, right?
Yeah.
So it depends on the labor amounts, I think, is the big part. But in the US, the people that have started the manufacturing here and that have everything set up and they have their compliance and everything, government contracts, or if they're not into government contracts, they absolutely need to get into them, because that's how I think that's how they're going to win long-term plays, is government contracts with GSA, things like that, where they have to be either Bari compliant, which is it's North America, or US manufactured. So I think those are the long-term plays for companies like that. That's the smarter play, unless they already have their customer set up. So, yeah.
Manesh, I also want to add maybe just a couple of things. We've actually seen contracts, or been involved with contracts as of course, as a compliance company, not as a producer, but where there are portions of it that are required to be made domestically, and there are portions of it that are open to the free market, right? And I think that kind of ties into both what Steve and David are saying is that you need a combination of a good, healthy domestic market that's producing it, but you also need the accessibility to have a supply chain as well. Because, you know, I think one of the things we learned from the pandemic was we don't know when we need really a large capacity, much larger than we expected. So I think the supply chain offers the resilience aspect of being able to sort of flex that capacity as needed. I think what's important is that you want a risk resilient supply chain, right? Not just a resilient supply chain. So a lot of the discussion is really about, you know, how do we create a risk resilient supply chain? So when we do need to hit that button, we know that we're getting something that we want in the way that we want it.
Yeah, true. The follow-up question to this from the same audience is there a preference from the buyer side on US production versus overseas production? And frankly speaking, from where I see it, buyers don't care that much yet. I don't see it changing very rapidly. They care more for if the product is good quality, if it meets all the standards of their end usage, and if the price points are competitive enough. Businessmen are not going to be the ones deciding that they would move the production into the US or outside unless until there is a big need for it or there is a regulation against it. So I don't see that changing. I'll move into the next question that we have to answer here, which is how will trade and payment terms, and Steve, we were discussing earlier on, some change already happening and credit terms that buyers need. And before the pandemic, everybody was getting credit terms 30, 60 days. This has all changed now. How do you see that change happening? And are we at a cusp of industrial change here?
Yeah, I mean, at the beginning, I mean, especially when I was in India, I mean, it was such a cash flow intensive business. And I mean, I would see in the streets of India, people just walking around with duffel bags full of cash. For instance, I've never seen something like that in my life. It was very interesting, but obviously settling down. Yeah, I mean, LCs are becoming very, very prevalent. You're seeing a huge shift in the financial sector going and being more open to PPE stuff. A lot of it on the hedge funds and private side or to gloves, but also on the PPE side for factor and PO financing. We have some really, really good relationships that we've nurtured over the last years because this is going to be needed. It doesn't matter what company you are, unless you're Apple or you're the U.S. Treasury, you can print your own money, something like that. So no matter what, you're going to need financial options, and there's big shifts and that industry right now. But I see the biggest one as being in LCs and having better terms on LCs or just other companies. I think it goes both ways. I mean, there's a lot of companies opening for LCs, and the US banking system being the US banking system that we're in, if we're specifically talking about United States, is a lot of the bigger banks, they're very, very, they don't like any risk at all. I know this because both my parents are retired now, but dad was executive VP for Chase, mom worked there, family of bankers, been in banks all my life. I've never been in banks, but I've unfortunately had the great talks at dinner about all of that stuff for many, many years, and dealing with LCs for the last decade as well on internationally on the high risk markets and things like that US banks in particular just don't touch. Do you see a lot of shifts towards it and then a lot completely away from it? But I'd say for the better, and there's a lot of great payment opportunities and businesses that have completely shifted actually to the PPE side.
Steve, actually, we are working with certain new tech lenders, right? Where we are working on in the future, we will be incorporating APIs between trade finance companies and us, and they will automatically be able to run the credit of the buyer and give them credit terms 30, 60, 90 days, depending on who the buyer is and stuff. So we are going towards that as a business as well. But I see already for certain customers of ours, we are going to be able to ready to offer credit terms. Again, it all depends on their credit backgrounds. Brokers and dealers may not be able to get those same deals, but the end buyer, surely we can offer it to them now, but which we did not. Like I told you, we were working with NHS in 100% cash. We were working with University of Pittsburgh Medical Center in 100% cash. We work with Hogue Hospital in cash. These guys, we could have given credit terms, but there was just no credit available in the market. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Guys, before we end this discussion, anybody wants to add anything pertinent to this particular topic or anything that we did not cover related to the future for this trade?
I would just add that everyone bear in mind that as we look toward the future, the whole idea of knowing your supply chain is something that applies to small or large firms. You know, don't think that this is a small, or I mean, a large firm only or a large enterprise only discussion. The other thing is really in your relationships, thinking more about what we refer to as proof or evidence that you've made every reasonable effort to understand that supply chain is also very important. And I think if you just move forward with those two concepts in mind, you'll be successful and de-risked in the approach that you take.
Yep. David?
No, I think Andre summed it up. I mean, there's plenty of tools and instruments out there, and as he said, you know, just and I keep sort of repeating myself, but you know, get the appropriate certification in place, and you know, make sure you know who your suppliers are, and make sure your supply chain is equipped to the requirements of modern day supply chains, because we live in a very transparent world today. Everybody sees everybody knows what's happening, and you know, a lot of issues are not about product quality issues, but they're about behavioral issues. So if you don't know your factories, you don't know your facilities, and you don't know where your products are being made, well, then you can't control product quality, process quality, and behavior quality. And, you know, just to give you a scale of the enormity of the problem that we have is that, you know, manufacturing has gone offshore today. You know, 100 years ago, everybody purchased from suppliers within around 60 kilometers of where their factories were, and you put a handshake into business. So today we're going through the internet, and, you know, many organizations don't know who the real manufacturers of their products are, because we have a lot of intermediaries, wholesalers, domestic importers, and you can't manage the new risks that we have without knowing who your suppliers are. We've seen that with food recalls, with toy recalls, with automotive recalls, with pharmaceutical recalls. It is a real issue, but it is easy to handle, but it comes at a cost. So you've got to look at that as a cost of production and a cost of compliance. If you want to take shortcuts and you don't want to do those things and you're into a numbers game, well then all I can say is hope is not always a method. And you may get away with it, and but you may have your train crash.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, some of the greatest companies out there that have got great supply chains, you know what, they've all had their train crashes. And that's why they're good, because they know what the, you know, the quality costs are of when something goes wrong, and there's a loss of trust there with consumers and their brand. And they spent years and years rebuilding that, putting the right thing in place to start with.
Yeah.
And Manesh, just, you know, finally, thank you very much for the invite, and, you know, great to catch up with Steve. First time I met Steve. Always great to chat with yourself and Andre as well. So thank you for the opportunity.
Steve, you want to?
I mean, Andre and David, yeah, you guys summed it up very well. I think the biggest takeaway is, I mean, it's pretty vague in saying this, but it kind of holds true, right? Is education and learning about the processes on everything we've talked about. Also strategic planning, whether you're buy, intermediary, or sell. You got to know and you got to hedge your bets on what's coming up next, and diving into niches again, whether you're a buy, intermediary, or sell side, on a business perspective. Go in there and you try to just sell whatever you can in front of you. It's not going to work out. Strategic plan is by far, and I'm the first to admit, and like we've all seen and talked about as well. Failure is the best learning tool, and I've definitely done my fair share as well. So
yeah,
that's it. I definitely appreciate the time and the knowledge that Andre and David shared, and thanks for the invite, Manish.
Thank you, Steve. I will summarize the plug for all of us. So anybody that wants their factories verified and wants to really understand what goes under the hood of the factories, please reach out to David, reach out to BSI, and look at the Verify solution. For anybody wanting to do audits and maintain their costs in relatively proper ways and understand what is going on into those factories in terms of social compliance, environmental compliance, and any other compliance issues, please reach out to Andre and HAP, and they will help you out. And those guys wanting to buy gloves and masks and gowns, you can find those products from KishKindha on our website, but you can also go directly to Steve. And of course, any other products that you want sourced in Asia or elsewhere, and you are having troubles, reach out to BuyHive. We have over 400 SKUs already on there. They are from vetted suppliers. We will help you out, get those products to you. Thank you, guys. Thank you, everybody. See you.
Appreciate the time, guys.